and welcome to another episode of Exploring with the Estuarium. My name is Aeriel, and I'll be your educator. Today we're going to learn all about oysters, exactly what kind of fish are these shellfish, if they have a heart, and just how important they are to our ecosystem.
During this lesson, you'll get answers to questions such as, what is inside an oyster's stomach? What function does the adductor muscle serve? And why are oysters important to our estuaries? You can follow along this lesson by using our student activity worksheet. What is an estuary? An estuary is a place where fresh water from rivers and streams meet the salt water from the ocean. The Puget Sound is the largest estuary by volume and the second largest by shoreline in the U.S. In the Puget Sound, there are intertidal ecosystems. What is the intertidal ecosystem? What are the boundaries? Here in Washington, there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. The intertidal zone is the coastal area that is above water during low tide and below water during high tide. This ecosystem can offer many different types of habitat, from rocky shores to sandy beaches and mudflats. Different animals live in these different habitats and have adapted physical characteristics to help them live there. What is an adaptation? Organisms adapt or change over time. One small change or mutation in an individual organism, perhaps a color or size change, for example, can be passed on to its offspring if it survives long enough to reproduce. If the individuals with this trait continue to survive and reproduce, the trait can be passed on to each subsequent generation. If the adaptation is beneficial to the organisms that have this trait, it will help them survive in their ecosystem. The trait will continue to be passed on, and more individuals in this species will have this trait. Adaptations are furthered in populations by natural selection. Can you think of an adaptation that helps oysters survive in the intertidal zone? Oysters are able to survive by tightly closing their shells until high tide returns. This adaptation allows them to avoid predation from organisms that might remain in the water, like marine snails. Their hard shells also prevent any predators from reaching their soft bodies. The shell not only helps protect them from predators, but also helps keep water in during low tide so that oysters are still able to get oxygen. Their shell is also one physical feature that helps scientists classify these animals into groups. There are many ways to group living things into categories. Scientists can group animals based on what they look like or their adaptations. We're going to explore one broad group of animals called mollusks. The phylum Mollusca means soft body. Mollusk animals are sea snails, bivalves, and chitons. They all have the following adaptations in common: soft body, one or more shells usually, a mantle that covers the internal organs and typically secretes a shell, a radula excluding the bivalves, a muscular foot, and bilateral symmetry. What is an oyster? Oysters are mollusks, which means they are related to animals like octopus, clams, and snails. Oysters are also bivalves, meaning that they have 2 shells. The shells of oysters grow along with the oysters. Oysters spend 3 to 4 weeks drifting as plankton before they find a hard place to settle and continue growing. Once settled, they begin to filter feed on the microscopic animals, plants, and bacteria that live in the seawater. The more an oyster eats, the more energy it must build and strengthen its shell using calcium carbonate. It can take up to 3 years for an oyster to reach the size of 3 to 6 inches long. The Pacific oyster can grow to over 10 inches long and can live up to 40 years. Oysters can also make pearls. This happens because some sort of disturbance enters their shells, such as a grain of sand. To protect itself from the disturbance, the oyster layers the item with the same material used to make its shell, and the pearl is eventually formed. Now let's take a closer look at the oyster. The oyster has 2 outer shells and a hinge, which is the connection point between the 2 shells. It also has a mantle. The mantle is 2 fleshy folds of tissue that cover the internal organs of the oyster and are always in contact with the shell, but not attached to them. Its principal role is in the formation of the shells and the secretion of the ligaments, as well as playing a part in other biological functions, such as sensory receptors, egg dispersal, respiration, reserve stores, and excretion. On the outer edge of the mantle are sensory tentacles. The sensory tentacles help the oyster filter feed. Oysters also have gills. The gills are the largest organ in the oyster's body and consist of 4 folds of tissue. Along with the mantle, it is the chief organ for respiration. They create water currents, collect food particles, and move food particles to the labial palps for further sorting. Also serves to separate masses of eggs released from the ovary during spawning into individual ova for efficient fertilization. Oysters have labial palps consisting of two pairs of large soft flaps that are roughly a triangular shape and have a smooth surface and a rough surface. These specialized organs are known to control the total amount of food ingested, but may also sort food before ingestion, perhaps based on particle size or chemical composition, similar to the human mouth. Oysters also have a stomach and an anus that help in the digestion of phytoplankton and zooplankton. The oyster's adductor muscle is a prominent organ situated in the posterior region of the oyster's body, consisting of an interior translucent part and a smaller white crescent-shaped region. The function is to close the oyster's shell. Relaxation of the adductor muscle allows the shell to gape open. And finally, the organ that makes the oyster run is its heart. A small three-chambered heart lies underneath the adductor muscle and pumps colorless blood to all parts of the body. An oyster can filter up to 40 gallons of water per day. Oyster filtration can help mitigate excess nutrients in our waters. People all around the world like to eat oysters, and Washington State produces the most oysters of any other state in the U.S. Over 80% of the oysters produced on the West Coast come from right here in Washington. Oyster farms are important because they provide a way to harvest the shellfish without taking from and overwhelming the wild populations. Oyster farms generate jobs, help the economy, and create habitat for tidal organisms and fish. Oysters are very important for our estuaries. They are filter feeders. They filter the water, removing organic and inorganic particles from the water column, resulting in cleaner water, which positively impacts other species. They provide habitat. The presence of oyster shells creates a hard-bottom substrate that provides habitat for other bay organisms, like barnacles, mussels, and anemones, all require a hard bottom on which to attach and to grow. Oysters are also important on an economic level, since they provide a market for food and a way for life for many people of the Puget Sound. Now we will review the student activity worksheet and answer the questions about oyster anatomy and the roles the oysters play in our estuaries. For question number 1 on the student activity worksheet, complete the table below. The shell is the outer part of the oyster. The sensory tentacles are the lining edge of the mantle. The gills are the 4 flaps that help filter out the water. The mantle is the tissue that lines the shell. The adductor muscle is the muscle that helps open and close the shell. The labial palps are the 4 triangle pieces attached to the gills. The hinge is the point where the 2 pieces of shells connect. The stomach is attached to the labial palps. The heart can be found next to the adductor muscle, and the anus is the end of the digestive tract. For question number 2, since oysters are filter feeders, what would you find inside their stomach? Phytoplankton, zooplankton, or even detritus, which is decaying material. Question number 3, what function does the adductor muscle serve? The adductor muscle holds the 2 shells together. And the last question, why are oysters important for our estuaries? They are filter feeders. They filter our water and remove particles and clean our waters. Without them, our waters would be much more murkier. They also provide habitat. Oyster shells create hard bottoms for barnacles, mussels, and anemones to attach to and grow. Also, when the oyster shells break down, the calcium carbonate from those shells help other animals with exoskeletons build their shells. And lastly, oysters are valuable to the people of the Puget Sound. They provide cultural importance, food sources, and jobs for many people around the Salish Sea. Next time you're at your local beach or estuary, don't forget to thank our favorite filter feeder, the oyster, for keeping our waters clean.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Exploring with the Estuarium. If you liked our video, give it a thumbs up, and if you wish to continue to get more of our educational videos, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Facebook at the Puget Sound Estuarium. Bye!